Hello, this is Dr. Rathika Marsh, the Spiritual Psychologist. Do you want to know what it means to be trauma informed? There is so much confusion around this term. In this episode, we are diving into what it actually means, the layers and complexity around it, and where to start in getting trauma informed. I am speaking today to Claire Diane, who is a nervous system coach, somatic practitioner, and educator. Her mission is to support soul driven entrepreneurs, women to claim inner safety, expand their capacity, activate their inner authority, and boldly step forward as the sovereign women that they are into new levels of impact, leadership, and authentic self-expression. This episode is gold. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Claire. I'm so happy for you to be here.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
You have just so much wisdom and knowledge about trauma, very strong messages about being trauma informed. I thought it'd be helpful to start the conversation with what is trauma, first of all. If we can summarize that from your perspective, what is it? And then we
Mm.
can kind of go into, okay, so what does it mean to be trauma informed?
So, of course, there are lots of different ways that trauma has and can be defined. And I think one definition of it that's really helpful is to understand that trauma is really about any experience or, experiences that are overwhelming, and that in that moment we don't have the resources or the resourcing available to support us to effectively deal with that situation. And so what happens is that our nervous system, whenever we perceive a threat, either we perceive it or there actually is a threat in our environment, our nervous system moves into a stress response, and we call these trauma responses when we get stuck in them. So I'm sure many of us will have heard of those, but the really four main trauma responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn.
Mm-hmm.
We can go into them more if we want to, but essentially with trauma, what happens is that we go into one of these stress responses, one of these four responses, and this is not a conscious decision that we make with our conscious cognitive mind. Our nervous system doesn't make value judgments. It just takes the information and makes a decision in like the split second of time of like, what is the appropriate response? So if I can fight this threat, if it's something I can mobilize outwards to fight and deal with in that way, then I will. If that is deemed by the nervous system, not the mind, as something that's not possible or appropriate, then it's trying to run away. If neither of those are appropriate, it might be to just go into more of an immobility response and more of that freeze place, or the form response, which is where we try and create safety through really social engagement, through submitting and appeasing. And we can get stuck in those responses essentially with trauma, where we don't move out of them because there isn't that resolution into safety.
Yeah. I saw a really interesting post by somebody who said everyone is calling everything trauma now, and it invalidates the experiences of people who have experienced real trauma.
Mm.
And oh,
Yeah.
it really hit a nerve for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what, like, for you, is there a difference between human responses, like
Mm.
typical human responses that we have, just from being human,
Yeah.
and which in itself is a load, it's like a that's already complex. That's the thing, isn't
Yeah.
it?
It's,
And what is a trauma response?
yeah.
That's the bit I think that people find confusing. And I,
Mm.
I refer to trauma and emotional wounds. The two blur.
Yeah, and no one else can define what is or is not traumatic for another body, another human being.
Yes,
Right? Only
exactly.
we get to define that for ourselves. And when you said that, you saw that post saying it invalidates what real trauma is. I mean, well, what is real trauma? What is trauma to one person? What's real trauma to one person isn't going to be what's real trauma to another person. And I think in this question of like discernment, it's one thing to find something uncomfortable or to have a preference, like, I don't like this kind of thing, or I do like this kind of thing, or this thing is like makes me feel uncomfortable. But it's another thing if we actually experience a sense of not feeling safe in our bodies around something, if we
Yes.
move into one of those responses, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, by definition, if that is what's happening in response to our environment, in response to people we're around, in response to things that happen in our business, that's not just a human, oh, I kind of don't like that thing very much.
Yes. Yeah.
That's actually coming from a place of trauma. And like with trauma, our capacity for regulation gets hurt. Our capacity to manage our internal world in a way that has some kind of coherence and sense of organization and a feeling of competence and confidence within that gets really hurt. So we very easily get derailed as well. Something will have a response to something which we're not able to manage very effectively. It might go on for a long time. We might not experience a sense of our agency within that, our power to like do
Yes.
something about that. So there definitely is a difference between general human responses of like not liking something or something
Yeah.
making me feel a bit uncomfortable versus something that actually makes me feel unsafe on like a
Yes.
cellular level, and therefore elicits a trauma response, which is really a response in service of survival. It's what our bodies do to try to keep us safe.
Yeah, and I think there's something that you're saying there, which is for me with the clients I work with, there's something about the consistency of response as well, isn't there?
Yeah,
That there's that consistent thing, that consistent somatic response, or linked into also then beliefs and thoughts and how you view the world, all of that which prevent people from living in the truth of who they are, because
yeah,
there's so much shame around who they are, so they're not able to then express themselves in a way that feels aligned or live life in a way that feels good, because they don't feel that sense of safety
yeah.
around who they are and their relationships.
Yeah, and our mind and our bodies are on different pages with
Mm.
trauma. It's like the mind might be saying one thing or thinking one thing, and the body has a very different opinion. And often that's like the mind is, oh, why is this thing such a big deal for me? Like, why is putting my face on a video or speaking my opinions in a public setting, like, you
Yes.
know the mind can be saying, oh, this is fine, there's nothing to worry about, why, there's nothing to be afraid of. But the body has a very different opinion, and the body is always what wins out, and you can push past your body. And I did that for years.
Yes.
Like, you can dissociate from your body, you can push through, but
Yeah.
it always bites you in the ass, because yeah, it leads
You
to
can,
burnout, it leads to a
yeah.
lot.
And it's that thing of like, you can be functioning and still alongside it be in trauma states.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah,
it's that
until you're not functioning.
yeah, exactly. And
Mm.
often it's that, like, on, we switch between being like really high functioning and then under functioning, really high
Mm.
functioning, under functioning, which is often a precursor for people who burn themselves out. Often
Yes.
that's the state that they've been in for a long time, is just like over functioning, which is usually the pushing through the body, forcing, efforting, I
Yes.
can get such stuff done. But then there's the backlash, which is that the body just goes into a bit of immobility, and then we can't do
Yes.
something, and then we push through that, and then but over periods of time, that's not a very fun or nourishing way to live a
No,
life.
it isn't. I think it's important to say as well that there's still such traditional ideas, aren't there, of what trauma is, because there's still those ideas of it being like, okay, trauma is caused from a single event, or
Yeah,
trauma is caused from quite severe experiences.
Mm.
The traditional ideas of trauma are around sexual abuse, persistent physical abuse, severe neglect, and those types of, I guess, boxes.
Yeah.
And there's just so much more complexity to it. And often traditional ideas are very patriarchal as well. They don't consider culture, they don't consider different backgrounds, communities. And so what can happen is that you find that this is definitely what I felt on my journey, was this total disconnection with my own um pain, or my own disconnection, because it was like, okay, well, there's this feeling of like, what is wrong with me?
Mm.
Because, okay, maybe I might tick like one of those boxes, but I had an all right childhood, you know? And so there's it then leads to an invalidation of
Yeah,
your lived experience, and that is then dangerous, because you're left with this feeling of, is there's something wrong with me?
exactly. Yeah, it's like, I don't make sense, there's something wrong with me. I think we have to remember that, even PTSD hasn't come into our like language for very long if we look at the trajectory of time. So trauma has existed for thousands and thousands of years, and it's only very recently in our timeline of human history that we have named trauma as something. And of course, when we first did that, that was all languaged and defined around PTSD. And it's only very recently, I think it was only in 2021, that CPTSD as
Yes.
complex trauma was actually identified as a proper medical diagnosis, a psychological diagnosis. So it's also really just acknowledging that trauma has existed for thousands of years, and our defining of it is a very, very new thing. And even so much of it still is very based around the things that did happen to us. And it's much harder to validate and to see the intangible, in a sense, causes of trauma, which is to do with those missing experiences, the things that we didn't get, not being delighted in, not being mirrored properly by our caregivers, not being attuned to, not having a consistent regulating presence growing up. All of those things we can't pinpoint as saying this one thing happened to me, but it's a chronic experience of something that we have a biological need for, and we didn't get that need met. And because those needs for attunement and connection and relational safety are biological, there are very real consequences in our biology when we don't get them. And trauma is biological. Trauma isn't the story. Trauma, we know all these quotes, trauma isn't what happened to us, it's actually what is happening within us now because of what happened to us. And so I think it's just so important that we acknowledge the more complex and nuanced truth of trauma, and because it also makes space for intergenerational trauma and the way that that's passed down, and that you can't see or touch that usually, right? But it has a very real effect and consequence in future generations. So it's so important, because collectively, it's about us coming back home to ourselves and realizing that actually fundamentally we are whole, that we do make sense, and that when we can identify something, I really believe, because in my own life it's been so important. I was traumatized for most of my life without knowing it, and it was only when I realized what trauma was, and that it wasn't only this one thing I'd been led to believe it was. I realized what it was, and I realized that actually that was something I was suffering from. It was like a huge penny dropping in my life, and it changed so much for the better. And I wouldn't be where I am right now if that hadn't been something that I had realized for myself.
Yes, definitely. It's an awakening.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does it mean then? In What does it mean to be trauma informed?
What a lot of people see as being trauma informed, I often think is actually what it means to be trauma aware.
Yes.
Because there's trauma awareness and there's trauma informedness, and they're not actually the same thing. So trauma awareness is that I have an awareness of, you know, what trauma is, and I have an awareness that it is a thing that exists, and I might have read a lot of books about the what. So it's the more cognitive awareness that this is what this thing is, and this is just the fact that it actually exists. And a lot of people then sort of extrapolate that to meaning that they're therefore trauma informed. But really, trauma informedness is about, yes, we need to, you know, realize what trauma is. We need to recognize that it exists. We need to know, and this is the big piece, we need to know how to respond appropriately to what we know exists, and how to respond appropriately to trauma in human beings, and how in our response. So it's in the trauma informedness, it's so much about, you know, who we are being, and our capacity for relationality is a huge piece, and it's where it's much more about being able to create safe connections, being able to create relational resonance, being able to identify trauma responses in other people and knowing how to respond to that, knowing how to lead, whether it's like in leadership or facilitation or coaching, but knowing how to create more sense of agency for people, more sense of choice, more sense of consent, more sense of connection. And all of those things, if you only know what trauma is and you're aware of it, how that often does not get translated into actually an embodied relational capacity to respond to trauma in other people, and to feel competent in how you're able to do that. And I think whether or not we realize it, you know, the way that most human beings have learnt to cope in their life is because of the impact of trauma. You know, the way many of us cope is through our trauma responses, is through the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, you know. And constantly in our work, the things that we're exposed to are at least partly due to trauma. You know, the stresses if we work in a team, you know, so the stresses that people have, if we're working in like one-on-one coaching, like people, the struggles that people have, the conflicts that people have, so many of these things are to do with the impacts of trauma. And I just think there's really no way in which actually becoming more trauma informed in that deeper embodied relational way doesn't make you better at what you do.
And when we talk about relational, what we mean by that is in relationship with whoever we're supporting or guiding. So whether it's a friend, you know, for people who aren't coaches listening to this, or therapists or whoever, it's about how we are interacting as a whole as well, isn't it? As a collective, as a community, to support each other. If you go to a yoga class, for example, and you're functioning from a place of trauma, it can so easily bring it up. If you go into a breathwork session and, you know, you're guided by somebody who with good intention is trying to lead you through something, but then is, you know, an hour later is out the door, and you're left with a huge somatic response with nobody kind of being there to hold you, that's really deeply activating, and it can lead to the shutdown, kind of, it can lead to shutdown of, okay, I'm not going anywhere near any of those things again.
Yeah. And I think the relational, you know, in the way that I teach it, it's so much about this like embodied embodied relational piece of like us as facilitators, as whatever we do, whether we're a yoga teacher, a coach, a team leader, that we actually are able to be more embodied in our own selves and to be more present. And the, you know, in my ethos and the way that I teach trauma informedness, it really does start with our foundation in ourselves as well, because if we want to live in a more trauma informed world, if we want to be able to create more trauma informed spaces for communities and other people we work with, we have to live trauma informedness in our own lives. And that really does mean prioritizing and focusing on our own level of resource, like how connected to ourselves are we, what is our capacity to be present, to hold the experience of another, and to kind of host that within our nervous system. And so I think there's such a big invitation in being trauma informed to work on our own embodiment of connection and like inner safety within that, because that's how we're able to offer it to other people. And
definitely, because otherwise, like, I know this myself, the way that it comes out is that your stuff impacts on your work. You know, it impacts on how you're supporting people, because you're unable to like see, or I guess take that responsibility for um how you're supporting somebody. So it can become quickly about you and your own responses rather than the needs of the client.
exactly. And it's hard to be held account, you know, when we're struggling within our own unidentified, because it doesn't mean that we have to completely have healed all our trauma, whatever the heck that means, you know, but it's that we're able to recognize and respond to it within ourselves from a place of compassion and connection. And that's really what it's about. And without that, it's very hard to be accountable in our work, because being held accountable will elicit like a need to defend and protect myself. Fight, flight, freeze form will come out. It's very hard to see other humans clearly as well, because when we're seeing the world through our own trauma responses, we don't see clearly, you know, it's like we're seeing through cracked glass. And that's where a lot of projection happens. It's where a lot of relational disconnect happens, because there is not this, and again, you know, in my work I talk a lot about the relational field in this space of like unconscious nervous system communication that exists between two people. And as facilitators and leaders, whatever we do in our work, when we are coming from a place of our own trauma, it's like it sends out a very incoherent kind of muddy message in that relational field, and that's not a space where we can co-create safety, resonance, connection. So it's not about feeling the need to be perfectly healed, or, you know, completely rid of any of our patterns that we struggle with, but it is this real invitation for us to start with ourselves and to realize that we can't give to other people what we don't have to give to ourselves. And it's really that focus on our own resourcing and running our business also in ways that feel consentful and cooperative to ourselves. You know, that's also a really important part of it. And I think in terms of relationships, you know, collectively, for so long we've been in this space of like power over hierarchy, where it's about like domination and power over. And I think collectively now we're really having this movement towards like the importance of relationality, of like relationships, of human connection, human warmth. And I really see that as something that's like collectively happening. And I think it's beautiful because it's a need that we have as well, right? And so as leaders, the more we can really bed down into how we're able to co-create experiences of safety and connection and relational resonance, like with and for other people, it makes our work better. It gives other people more of a experience of engagement and transformational experience of like being held in our care, and just collectively it starts to shift
What do
whole
you mean
energy.
by relational resonance?
That we're able to attune, like
Mm-hmm.
attunement,
Mm.
you know, this capacity, like, which is really like, I feel you and I feel you feeling me. It's
Yes.
attunement, that there is this space between us where we're in this like resonant connection.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I can feel you I feel you in myself,
Mm-hmm.
because where we are carrying trauma, we don't really feel other people. Like, other
Yes.
people arise in us in a blank space, in a
Mm-hmm.
protected space, but
Mm-hmm.
our capacity to actually feel the nervous system, the energy, to feel another person, like, that gets really hurt with trauma. So
Yeah.
relational connection is that I can feel you, like, I
Mm.
can actually feel you in my body,
Mm-hmm.
and that I can give you through that the experience that you feel me feeling you.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
that creates safety. And we can think
Yes.
about times like that we've felt that with people, where maybe we've gone to a friend and we've had something really difficult to talk about, and they've just like been kind of on their phone or not really
Mm.
listening. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuns our nervous system a bit. If
Yes.
we're not, there's no resonance, and it doesn't
Yeah.
create safety.
If you're not aware of your own um, trauma responses, and when you are responding from that place of defensiveness or whatever it might be with clients or potential clients or whoever it might be, that yeah, that then overspills, doesn't it? And it's tricky. It's not easy at all, because I know that I've worked with clients, and um I've had to really check myself, because it can bring up stuff around your worth,
Oh yeah.
around the impact that you're having, whether you're enough,
Yeah.
and there can be conflict sometimes, disagreement and all of that. It's like you've got to be very mindful of how you are navigating your own wounds in that sensitive process, whilst also honoring your needs.
Yeah, and that's what, yeah, it is a complex thing. And I think that's why
Mm.
it's so important for me. One of the most like trauma informed practices that we can do in our business is to actually create space to digest those difficult moments.
Yes.
That, like, something happens in a session where, oh, I felt myself get a bit triggered there, or I felt that there was a disconnect, or like I
Mm.
felt that I said something and it didn't land with a client and she had a response to that, and then my response to that was to do, there's
Yes.
so
Yeah.
much nuance and complexity that can happen. And I think what really often takes place when those kind of things happen is that they're difficult, they're um painful and difficult, and we label them as that, and then we don't really want to look at them again. So when the
Yes.
session ends, we feel a bit like, oh, maybe that was a difficult session, and then we move on, right?
Yeah.
But whenever we are experiencing that kind of difficulty in session, it's always because something within my unconscious
Mm.
has been, like, we could say triggered, but we could also
Yeah.
say touched. Like, something
Mm.
has been awakened in my unconscious, and there's definitely something there for me to make space, to process, to integrate,
Yes.
because all of those things can be so
Absolutely.
much growth when we do
Mm.
that. But
Yeah, and it is coming back to when you go through that process of identifying it, integrating it, processing the emotion around it, you can then come back to that space of, okay, I'm all right now. What can I do that is in the best interest of my client to support them to move forward, as
yeah,
opposed to this person's being really difficult.
exactly.
Why are they stuck? Why are they not moving forward? I'm not doing a good enough job, or like they're really difficult, and yeah, it then that all of that narrative, all of that kind of feeling that comes up in your body, it takes you away from um empowering the person that you're
Yeah.
working with.
And away from connection,
Yes,
and I
and
think a big,
compassion and
and
compassion.
yeah, and a big thing I used to identify a lot with was just the efforting that would happen in me when those kind of things. So
Mm.
I used
Yes.
to feel like, trying really, really, really hard, or something
Yes.
happens, or there's a slight relational, disconnect in a moment, and there's no space in that moment for me to like just take a breath and process that or re-regulate myself. And then it usually expresses itself as like efforting, which is where like we're trying really hard to like make it a good session, to
Yes.
say the right thing, to ask the perfect question. And of course, when we're coming from that place, that's actually like a lot of constriction in ourselves, and what messages our nervous system really sending to the nervous system of another person when we're doing that,
Yes.
and so I think it's so many invitations also. And that, in the way I teach trauma informedness, it's like I sort of language it and see it as like one big invitation into like a deep level of embodiment for yourself.
Yes.
And then
That's so beautiful, because I think as well that there can be like a bit of a response around the whole trauma informed movement, I guess, which feels a bit like you're being beaten by a stick. And
yeah,
it's really untrauma informed.
yeah,
That people have the intention of, I want to support people to be trauma informed, but I'm going to do it by like creating shame
yeah,
around you not being trauma informed.
exactly.
And then so then it's just like, okay, hold on, that's not very trauma informed.
It's not. And what does shame do? It freezes people. It's like if we
Yes.
actually want people to take an action in the direction of like collective
Mm.
growth and healing, which is the way I really see trauma informedness. It's like if I'm not inviting people into that with a sense of like some kind of excitement and like empowerment and like what I get to create,
Mm-hmm.
then how am I supporting that? Because so often it's exactly what you said, where it's so focused. A lot of marketing around trauma informedness is very focused on all of the things that are not trauma informed, and the things that people are doing that are wrong because they're
Yes.
not trauma informed. And
Yeah.
I've really been very mindful in my marketing and the way that I come at this, of just like, yeah, how can I create an invitation for people within this
Yes.
work, so that they're not coming in feeling shame that like I don't already know this stuff and I really should. It's like, well, why
Yes.
should I know this stuff? Like, no one's taught me. Like, no, we haven't spoken about it. Like, most coaching programs don't come from that place. And really being able to enter into a learning experience of trauma informedness that starts with our own experience of empowerment rather than shame, I think is really important.
Yes. So if there are coaches, healers, managers, anybody, mothers that are listening and they want to start the journey of becoming more trauma informed, where can they start?
I think a great place to start is to start with ourselves as well, and in the sense of like getting to know our own nervous system responses in a more intimate way, and being able to not over identify with our trauma response as part of our personality, and being able to see,
Yes.
like speak the language of our nervous system a bit more, which might look and sound like, I'm going to start with being able to notice and name when I'm in my fight response. Like, what does that feel like for me? Where does my energy in my body go? What kind of behaviors do I engage in? What kind of thoughts do I think when I'm there? My flight response, same questions. Freeze, fawn. So we're getting like much more intimate with our own nervous system responses, because that naturally leads out into being able to also do that for other people, and to honor that, like, we start replacing seeing things through the lens of pathology, or things that are not working, or things that are problems, or things that are broken, to actually seeing where there's dysregulation, where there is like where someone's regulatory capacity has been hurt. And I think when we can start doing that for ourselves, I think that's a really beautiful place to start in our own trauma informed journey, actually, and just learning to listen more to our nervous system, like in real time. Because the more I can listen to what's happening in this moment within my nervous system, within my body, the more I can actually respond to what's going on in myself and in other people, in my children, in my colleagues, in my coachees, the more I can respond to that rather than reacting. And I think that's actually a really beautiful place to start.
Yes, absolutely. It's the first
Mm.
place, isn't it? When we work on on healing ourselves, which is a continuous process, we create deeper medicine for others.
Yeah, I love that.
And yeah, it's so just so beautiful, isn't it? And that's why anytime like there's these shadows, these shadowy kind of aspects of ourselves that come up, it's an invitation, isn't it? It's an invitation, like you were saying earlier on, to heal that part of us and to invite light into it, so that we are then also better able to serve others.
Yeah. And just think, yeah, increasing our level of consciousness.
Yeah.
And just another thing, just that I think is really important when you ask the question, where do people start, is the piece around, getting more intimate with our own nervous system responses. And also that kind of practice I mentioned before of like, in your work, in your parenting, in your leadership, in your coaching, create a space for yourself to digest difficult moments. Like,
Yes.
you shouted at your kid in a really horrible way when you didn't mean to. Okay, make space later in your day to just sit with yourself and like reflect on what actually happened there. What was I feeling the moment before I shouted? What belief was I holding? To actually get more intimate with that, because it actually also builds our capacity to be able to be more connected. Because even when I name something like, oh, actually, when my daughter said that thing, I felt ashamed. So if I can name in that moment that shame was something I felt, I'm already building my capacity to feel shame, because I'm naming it for myself as an experience. So I think that's also, whether we say that in parenting or leadership or coaching, just creating space to digest difficult moments, which we can do by ourselves to a degree. And we also often need, coaching, therapy, supervision also to support us to do that. But
Absolutely. It's so underrated,
yeah,
the power of supervision. Like, yeah, I would not do what I do now without having good supervision in place, where I'm held with what comes up for my clients,
exactly.
that is reflected back to me. You know,
Yeah,
my work with clients reflects my own wounds
yeah,
in the areas where I feel stuck in supporting them. So
yeah.
yeah, it's so important, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Such a important, beautiful conversation. It's just also brought me back to just remembering like how important this work is, as coaches, as healers, as leaders, whatever that looks like for you, just how deeply important it is. It's about keeping yourself safe and keeping other people safe, as much as as much as you have the power to do so, I guess.
yeah. And I think it's how we change culture as well. It's how we start to change this like power over everything being about
Yes.
dominating, and
Yeah.
to actually being a culture that really values human connection and relationship,
Yeah.
and I think that's a part that we get to play as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. If anybody wants to find you, Claire, where's the best places?
Yeah,
Instagram.
so my Instagram, I'm pretty active on my Instagram. So that is at Claire_Diane_. And then you can also find me on my website, which is clairediane.com.
Okay, beautiful. And have you got any programs that are coming up that you're running soon?
Yes, so well, I'm currently launching the Vibrant Woman Method. So
Mm.
I don't know by the time this podcast comes out where I'll be with that. But that starts on the 20th of February, and that is a group somatic nervous system healing program. And then in April, I'll be enrolling for the next round of Anchored, which is my trauma-informed coaching and entrepreneurship training.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Thank you
Amazing.
so much for sharing, Claire. It's been so wonderful having you here. And I've just, yeah, I've loved the richness of our conversation. So thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you so much.